This is Michael Matheson Miller, and you are listening to the Moral Imagination Podcast. Thank you again for listening to the Moral Imagination Podcast. I'm delighted to have as my guest today, Professor Margarita Mooney. I'm grateful to all of you who have written reviews for the podcast at Apple Podcasts. If you do like the podcast, please give it a 5-star review. Also, thanks to all those people who've supported me on Patreon. I appreciate your support. It helps keep the podcast going. A couple of quick information. I wrote recently a short little book called Digital Contagion, about 10 steps that you can take to protect yourself from surveillance capitalism, cancel culture, and just data intrusion. You can get that at Amazon. You can also get a free infographic where I'll collect your data at themoralimagination.com. If you sign up, I'll give you a free infographic. And so I'll give you 2 hints. The first one is pay for your email. You pay for your plumber, you pay for your electrician, pay for your email, and 2, get a VPN, a virtual private network. And I talk about that and other things in this little book, Digital Contagion. Also, I want to let you know that I was recently the guest editor for Acton Institute's magazine, Religion and Liberty, where the topic was thinking in a time of ideology. And so I have essays from actually a number of people who've been on this podcast, Carlo Lanciolotti, James Bruce, Noel Mering, Sam Gregg, and others. So you can get that at acton.org, Religion and Liberty. And so my guest today is Professor Margarita Mooney. And I'm delighted to have her on the show. And I've talked to her over the years about lots of different things. And she writes on a number of different topics, especially on the love of learning. But we're going to talk a little bit about some of her early life and some of her early stories and how it led to her work in education. So just as a brief bio, and I'll put links to this, of course, on moralimagination.com on the show notes page, but she is currently an associate professor at Princeton Theological Seminary. She's served faculty at institutions of higher education since 2005, and she is the founder and the director of the Scala Foundation, which is a nonprofit educational research institution dedicated to restoring meaning and purpose to universities and schools by promoting a liberal arts education and also the intersection between social sciences and philosophy and theology. She's a prolific writer, and I'll put some links up to her work, but also in her education. She has a BA in psychology from Yale, an MA in sociology from Princeton, and a PhD in sociology also from Princeton. So, Margarita, thank you very much for joining the Moral Imagination Podcast.
Great to be here.
I'm delighted to have you. We've been trying to schedule this for a while, and so I'm delighted to have you. And I probably want to have you on this show like 4 times. So I'm hoping this one goes well so we can encourage you to come back because you do so many great things that really align with the themes of the Moral Imagination Podcast. But let's depart here from your most recent book, The Love of Learning, Clooney Media, and some of your most recent essays. And let's start with a recent essay that you wrote at Plow Magazine, talking about your experience in the 90s in Nicaragua. And as I think I told you, I had the chance to live in Nicaragua. My wife and I lived there from 2001 to 2004. But you were there in the mid-1990s working in a nonprofit. And you had some experiences there that shaped you. So let's go back. Why don't you tell us some of that story and let's begin with that.
Well, I recently decided to share some of my backstory in an article in the Plow Magazine blog about my 23rd birthday. Whereas part of my work studying the reintegration into civilian life of former combatants in the civil wars in Central America, I went with a group of former Contras, members of the Nicaraguan resistance, to a political rally that was also the celebration of a kidnapping. What I didn't realize was just how much danger I was stepping into, and that in fact, I was at risk of being kidnapped. But why am I sharing this crazy weekend from 1996 now? It's because I really wanted to share my own journey and how my hubris as a young, idealistic Ivy League graduate, thinking that the knowledge I had gotten in the Ivy League was going to help me go change the world, and how I confronted these problems that I cared so deeply about, but saw just how difficult it is to break the cycle of violence once it has exploded, and how in that crazy weekend, I met some women who had humility and an ability to forgive and a love that was stronger than violence. And so it's a reflection on the power of small acts of love to rebuild society from the bottom up. And frankly, it's a reflection on why we don't teach people that in elite institutions of higher ed. We teach them to think of themselves as somehow enlightened technocrats who are going to go change other people.
Right. That's, I think, a very interesting point because, as you know, I directed a documentary film called Poverty, Inc., where that's one of the themes. In the West, we have people with good intentions, highly educated, very skilled, but technocratic, who really don't understand the sources of maybe where our wealth and where our prosperity come from, going down with good intentions to kind of make a difference. And I think it's interesting how you went with this one attitude, but the shift to seeing the idea that it was these humble women who actually were a greater force than violence. And I think that's even hard for us to deal with because we all kind of want a political, technical solution to the problems that ail us. And you're, in a sense, saying, well, that doesn't mean politics aren't important, but ultimately it's this kind of human experience. One, did I get that right? And then two, I'd actually like you to tell the story because the story is kind of epic. I mean, when you started telling it to me the other day when we were talking, I have to say I got really anxious as I was listening to the story, right? As you were telling it, because you put yourself unwisely in real potential danger. So one, I mean, did I get this sense about the hubris humility thing correct? And then maybe you could just tell us the story.
Yes, you did get the idea correct about hubris and humility. And what I hope to share by talking about these stories is really my own journey from those experiences in Central America to graduate school in sociology at Princeton and studying Catholic social teaching, but also Catholic moral teaching, and coming to this realization that the only solution to problems of human poverty and violence have to be truly human solutions. They can't be simply about redistribution of resources or technological advancement, that the human person is the means and the end to solving their own problems. So what does that mean? I want to unpack. But let me tell you what I saw about the human person in my weekend with ex-Contras. So I start off in Managua, where I'm at a workshop with both ex-Contras and ex-Sandinistas, trying to help them work together to build sustainable development in Nicaragua. Following the end of the Civil War, there were bands of both ex-Contras and ex-Sandinistas who rearmed, trying to take land, because in spite of the fact that there had formerly been a cessation of violence, their economic sustainability had been destroyed.
Can I pause you for a second? Mm-hmm. Okay, so maybe before you go into the story, maybe give a little bit of background, Nicaragua, the Civil War, the Sandinistas, the Contras, just for listeners maybe who aren't familiar. I mean, you and I are familiar with this, but maybe there are listeners who this is a little bit outside. So let's just give even a brief context of what was going on and then how you got there.
So in the 1980s, Nicaragua had a prolonged battle between two sides called the Contras and the Sandinistas. The Sandinistas were a political party and a military force that overthrew the dictator Somoza, and they instituted a Marxist-inspired Cuban and Soviet-aligned socialist regime that outlawed private property, amongst other things, and expelled a lot of people. Now, the resistance, the Nicaraguan resistance, called the Contras, were aligned with the United States and were trying to get rid of the Sandinistas in control. So this local civil war was part of a larger geopolitical struggle called the Cold War, where you had the pole of the United States that believes in free markets and democracy and religious freedom, and you had the pole supported by the Soviet Union through Cuba infiltrating Central American conflicts. I worked for the former president of Costa Rica, Oscar Arias, who had won a Nobel Peace Prize in 1987. And the arrangement that he brokered amongst the Central American presidents at the time, including the Sandinistas, was that they fight their own battles and they not allow foreign influence, whether that be American or Soviet, and that they let the people speak, that they agreed to hold elections. So the Sandinistas went to the ballot box thinking that their socialist revolution was popular and they would win. They did not win. That led to the end of the conflict formally in Nicaragua and also helped and the conflicts in the rest of Central America, because now there was no communist-run country in Central America. Mm-hmm. Now, fast forward, I'm there in 1996. It's the next round of the political elections. And the economic development in Nicaragua has not taken off, and people are beginning to rebel again. So the country is on the verge of going back to civil war or supporting democracy. So I went on a weekend to visit a group of ex-Contras led by someone named the Jackal, who had kidnapped a government delegation that had come to negotiate their disarmament. And what they negotiated for was greater economic development in their town. And this kidnapping had turned the town into the one economic miracle of all the ex-combatant communities. So I wanted to meet the Jackal, and I wanted to see with my own eyes this economic miracle. I didn't only want to meet with the leaders of the Contras who came to Managua. I wanted to go to the homes and the living rooms of the people in rural Nicaragua who had lived through this battle and see with my own eyes the supposed economic miracle that had happened. What I underestimated was that the United Nations and the Organization of American States were correct to not send their workers to this town because it was too violent to get there. There was too many armed bands running around, and the town itself was not safe. But I went anyway, thinking that I'm in the company of a bunch of ex-Contras who know their way around. And that was partially true. But when we got to the plaza and I got taken up in conversation with a young woman who simply wanted to sell me her fruit, I walked away from the plaza with her for 10 minutes, during which time my hosts, the former commanders of the Contra, believed I had been kidnapped. So when I came back, they assigned a guard to me because they said that I was awfully naive and didn't realize how many guns were surrounding me and what a target there was on my back. So,
now, sorry, this would be the target, would be that the Sandinistas, because you were with the Contras, so the Sandinistas would want to kidnap you, or what was the danger there for you?
I would say at that point, what often happens at the end of civil wars, the violence continues without a political motive, purely economic. So after violence is done in the name of a political motive or kidnapping is done for a political motive, the people keep doing that as a form of extortion, right? So the kidnapping of me would have been a form of monetary extortion. It's not politically motivated.
Political. You weren't politically, okay, yeah.
So the Contras are admitting that they don't fully control the violence of the people under them. During the war, they directed it. But this is the whole problem. At the end of the war, they don't have to follow their commanders anymore, and they can keep going with the violence, right? So what I'm observing is these former commanders of the Contra admitting that they don't command the people under them anymore. And the people under them may not be politically motivated, but simply motivated by the color of my skin and the dollar signs that implies. So here I am in this plaza feeling such a conflict because I realize that the color of my skin means I'm worth a lot of money and I have a special status and I have all this special protection. But I'm really trying to learn from these young women who are farming the land, who are rebuilding the community. I wanted to connect with those young women because growing up, my mother was from Cuba and we helped Central American refugees who came to my hometown of Frederick, Maryland. So I wanted to go to the hometown of the people that I had grown up around and help them. And I realized that in my good intentions trying to help them, I could be shot or killed or kidnapped. And so I felt really torn because I believed in these young women. And yet I realized that I wasn't much help. I don't know how to sew. I don't know how to, plant anything. And here I am thinking that I have a special role to play. And really, it's the powerful acts of love of people who are getting back to work, who are plowing the land, trying to sell their goods. And they look at me with a smile and with love and with a desire to connect. I'm fluent in Spanish. And so I'm connecting with these people. Yet I'm realizing that when this whole event is over, I pile back into the truck full of AK-47s and get driven safely back to Managua, and they stay in that town probably for the rest of their life. So I start to feel rather worthless as a person. I think, I'm not special. I don't have any special knowledge. I don't have any special virtue. I'm really just an observer here. And my desire was to report back to people outside that there is hope, Michael, in spite of the fact that all the statistics I read about the bloodshed and the death and the killing, that there were people on the ground who were resisting that and who were turning over that soil and who were beginning to start a normal life. And that it's important to know that those people are there. And those people are the backbone of rebuilding a society after violence.
Yeah, that is a very powerful story. I mean, so I want to go into the story just a little bit more, and then we'll get into some of the lessons learned. But so you're 23 years old, is that right? And you're in a truck. I mean, this makes me nervous, okay, for you. You're in a truck with armed soldiers at the end of conflict, where you talk about the monetary reasons, not necessarily the political reasons, but also maybe just the habits of violence. Do you think that's right? That there's just habits of violence and chaos?
Absolutely. Even amongst my escorts, I recount how one of them, because it was my birthday, wanted to shoot off machine gun fire to celebrate my birthday. That's the title of the article, ráfagas. It means gunfire. This is a form of entertainment. I don't think shooting machine guns is a good form of entertainment. So he tries all night to tell me he's going to do this, but what ends up happening is he gets so drunk that he passes out. And so what I realized was that some of these men had taken up arms to defend their people against an injustice. And in so doing, they become captivated in a way by the thrill of violence. And he was looking for a reason to use that gun. And he had no reason to use it for my birthday. But he's so out of control of his passions that he passes out drunk instead of shooting a machine gun. So all of that is to show readers how I realized through this terrible experience what I had been writing about, that we can think that the human person, the progressive sense of the human person, we only use violence to promote a political end. And then we're going to lay down our arms and sing kumbaya with each other. What I learned is what I've since read in people like René Girard, Talal Assad, people who've written about the human heart has a kind of fascination with violence. And we don't like to talk about that in modernity. And let me tell you, when I came back from Central America, I didn't want to share these stories because I myself had experienced fear. I didn't want to admit to the amount of fear I was in that weekend.
Right.
And I didn't know how to solve this violence that I had seen. And so it's really easy to come back to the academy and sort of rest again in our development plans and theories and abstractions. But I had seen not just, the gunfire ideas, but I had seen how violence can take root in the human heart, which is why those actions of love of those young women really moved me, because they refused to participate in it. Even if it would have been economically beneficial, they were doing honest, hard work, loving God, praising God, and saying no to that cycle of violence.
So a couple of things that made me think of. One is I had the chance to go to Rwanda in 2008. We filmed there for Poverty Inc. And one of the ladies we met there, Janet was her name, she had actually, one of the projects that she did was to get women, and actually men ended up joining her, which is culturally radical, because the women were making baskets. And part of what happened was there were women from both the Hutus and the Tutsis, and she was doing a reconciliation project, really. And it was quite profound. I mean, she told stories, and we talked about this in Poverty Cure and Poverty Inc. a little bit, or Poverty Cure, I guess, is that there was a woman there whose husband had killed the other woman's family. And they had to work out this forgiveness. And I think, in a sense, they came to a point where more violence was not going to solve the problem. They had kind of run out their track of violence. So two things that kind of come to me as questions. One is maybe a big philosophical question. You brought up René Girard, or you think about Alexander Solzhenitsyn, I think talks about this. One question I want to ask you first is maybe could you, I don't want to get us too far off topic, but I think it's actually important. Could you talk a little bit about your experience, about how it made you think about violence, and then your later studies of people like Girard or others who write about violence, that it is, I think, maybe a naivete, is that the right word? Or a false optimism, that we don't take the dangers of violence penetrating our heart and the wicked things we can do. And like Aquinas, right, says, generally you want to avoid war. He's not a pacifist, right? Just war, you need war. But he said, but when war happens, people will do things they never would have done in another situation. So you want to be careful because you're opening up the door. And I remember the last thing about Rwanda, I remember I was actually living in Japan at the time of the Rwanda genocide. And I clearly remember this, like the magazines reading about it. And I think the headline was, "There are no devils left in hell. They're all in Rwanda." And just like I interviewed Immaculée Lebegisa about her book Left to Tell. And can you talk a little bit about, from that experience, but also from your experience as a philosopher, a theologian, and a sociologist, how should we be thinking about violence? Because I think you said, it's too messy for us. Does that make sense?
Look, this is a personal as well as a scholarly question for me. As I mentioned, my mother is from Cuba. I've made 7 trips to Cuba where I've met with political and religious dissidents, and I saw totalitarianism in action. I've met people who've been tortured in Cuba for their beliefs, buried alive underground. I wrote my first book about Haiti, and I went to the countryside in Haiti, met with people who had lived through rounds of violence around different political campaigns. I interviewed refugees from Haiti living in the United States and Canada and France. I interviewed a woman who had been raped as an act of political intimidation in Haiti. Now, anyone who studied war, as you have, or been in Rwanda, realizes that the raping of women is a common tactic to subdue civilian populations and humiliate people during violence, right?
It's horrible. Yeah, it's probably, I mean, the Russians did it, the Germans did it.
And listen,
everybody does it, and it's wicked.
Any woman like me who's been in those communities realizes that, but by some miracle, I myself wasn't a victim of that politically motivated kidnapping or economically motivated kidnapping or politically motivated rape. That's a fear in my heart that, thank God, has never happened. So when I was in graduate school studying sociology, I wasn't satisfied only to think about what was dominating at the time, right? Marxism versus some form of liberalism, because Marxism seemed to actually advocate violent revolution of the oppressed over their oppressors. And liberalism seemed to think that we could create a society where, through a set of procedures and commitments to individual freedom, we would all enter into a social contract and get along. And neither one of those, and now I'm simplifying those modes of thinking, but what I really found...
But it holds, though. I mean, your point holds, so...
What I found really profound was the writing, for example, of Catholic philosopher Jacques Maritain, who had helped found the Christian democratic parties in World War II, post-World War II Europe and Latin America, the writings of John Paul II, who had lived under communism. And I began to realize that the social progress that I wanted to see had to have as a prior condition moral virtue, right? The struggle in oneself for self-mastery.
Mm-hmm.
Because without that self-mastery, the use of violence, which should be rare and should be controlled and should be ordered, can easily explode, which is what I had seen time and time again. So I found, in particular, in the moral idea of virtue, which, by the way, transcends Catholicism and to all of Christianity and to all major world religions, have this idea that humans need to strive for self-mastery and they need to strive against the evil inside of their heart. And it seemed to me that in sociology, we didn't want to talk about evil being inside of someone's heart. Yeah. Evil was a property of the social, right? And this just doesn't line up with ethnographic work with people who have been in wars. Like, they have guilt, they have moral shame, they have moral guilt for what they've actually done. And so seeing people who had been leaders of violence and been victims of violence, you see the impact it has on their own moral conscience because they talk to you about it. So I really found through Jacques Maritain, John Paul II, Pope Benedict XVI, and through this rich tradition of Catholic social teaching, grounded in Catholic moral teaching, also reading Amartya Sen, Development is Freedom, right? People who see the human person has tremendous capacities for good, but is fallen in sin. And that any attempt to change the world will always fall short because human beings are sinful. So yes, we need social programs and we need financial resources, but we also need humility, not hubris. We need forgiveness, not revenge. And we need small acts of love, not just centrally coordinated top-down structures. You will never solve poverty with a totally top-down structure. Poverty needs to be solved with, I like the Catholic principle of subsidiarity, involving the people at the local level. Why? Not just because it's more economically sustainable, which I think it is, because it's more human.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because you're developing their own human potentiality. And that is the actual goal of economic development, is developing human potentiality, of which GDP may be one indicator, but it's not the central indicator.
Right.
The central indicator is people's ability to develop their own vocation and to serve others.
Yeah.
And I don't think we can capture this in an economic measure, but it's the desire of the human heart for meaning and purpose, which are extremely important to my entire approach to education. Because what I learned was this basic anthropological insight about the human person, that we desire meaning and purpose.
Yep. So that's so good. I mean, so you basically have to come back now because you've just set out like 4 podcast topics that we could spend an hour on each of them. So what I'd like to do is I want to keep that big picture in mind, if you don't mind. You're the guest, so you do have freedom to tell me, nope, I don't want to do that. So it's free. But what I'd like to do is take that big picture in mind and kind of drill down in a couple of the points you made with some questions. One, just a comment. I'm writing on this right now. It's something I talk about a lot, that one of the problems I think in development and poverty industry is that we shifted from charity to humanitarianism. And while that sounds like a kind of maybe semantics, but in short, that humanitarianism focuses on providing physical comfort, and it doesn't pay attention so much to the spiritual dimension or the moral dimension of the person. And part of that, the idea was not simply, let's be reductionist. It was saying, who cares about all the spiritual stuff? Let's get people fed and clothed. The problem is when that becomes the dominant view, it ignores human flourishing. And so what we've seen is, in a sense, a poverty industry that, what are the indicators? Well, GDP's grown. Yes, but is human flourishing grown? Right? And I think that's just one comment. A second comment, I think you bring out the importance of the principle of subsidiarity. So I'd like you to develop what subsidiarity is, but I would like to actually make this comment before I forget. I think a lot of people who know, this is for listeners who are a little bit more familiar with Catholic social teaching. We will go into it in a second if you're not. But I think there's a false opposition between subsidiarity and solidarity, as if somehow like, okay, this is solidarity and that's subsidiarity. And then, we have to choose which one. And the other very reductionist one is subsidiarity is local, private, and solidarity is government. And I think what you highlight there, and this is my language, but I think what you highlight there, so disagree if you think I misread you, is that it's actually in the practice of subsidiarity that solidarity grows, and vice versa. It's in solidarity that creates the impetus for the local solution. So that subsidiarity and solidarity are actually mutually reinforcing things that contribute to the common good. They're not opposed things. Okay, do you want to respond to that? And then also maybe for listeners who don't know what you mean by subsidiarity, go through that a little bit. So that's my 2-part question. What is subsidiarity? And do you think that my articulation of the mutually reinforcing nature holds, or do you think that's wrong?
Well, I think for listeners who may not be familiar with subsidiarity and solidarity, I think the debate that you're getting at some of the language I just used, right? Kind of top-down redistribution tends to be what comes to mind when people think of solidarity. Some people have more, they should give to people who have less. That's what it means to have solidarity. Subsidiarity in this narrative would be the people closest to the problem fix it for themselves, kind of bottom up. And I think I would agree with you that that's a false opposition. And in fact, those aren't even the proper usage of those words. But I say that because I just think it's so difficult for us to get away from the idea that solidarity means a redistribution of goods. But let's try to do it this way. Let's try to reframe our thinking about the economy as the end of the economy not being the amount of the economic value of how much a service can be sold for, but an infinite value of the human person expressing themselves through the act of creating something in the world. And if you get to that, you get to what I think the heart of Catholic social teaching says about the economy is that the economy is abundant. It has a superabundance because value is not the price at which something can be extracted from a person and sold on the market. Value is precisely the human person using his or her talents to create something in the world. So value is personal, not an economic thing. That may sound like a lot of words, but the difference is that if value is what I produce has an economic value, then you can come up with a number for that and you can divide it, right? But this is not my understanding of Catholic social teaching. My understanding of Catholic social teaching is that the value in what I create comes out of me as a human person and has a symbolic value, which is more important than its material value. And so that young woman who's selling fruit, the fruit has a certain economic value that she can exchange it for today, but it has a symbolic value that's more important because it expresses her creativity, her God-given gifts. And so solidarity in that context is, what does a society look like that woman and her neighbor and the other person all have the opportunity to develop their gifts and generate? It's a generative idea. And solidarity results when the conditions are such that people can use their gifts to generate an abundance of goods. That's solidarity for me. How do you set up property laws? How do you set up market exchanges? How do you set up educational systems? How do you construct the family to raise children? What are the common structures we need to create and reinforce in solidarity? Law, markets, education, families, so that everybody has a place to use their God-given talents. That's what I mean by solidarity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and to I know you, so just in case listeners, when you say set up the family, you don't mean a top-down structure of what the family looks like. You mean it's an organic recognition of what a family is. Right?
Exactly.
Yeah, I knew you did, but just in case a listener's misunderstood that, that's good.
Valuing the family, right? To begin with, valuing the family as the place of moral formation and generation of a new human being with a conscience, with character, right? Mm-hmm. This is the calling of the family, is to generate life, men and women committing their lives to each other, generating new life, and raising the next generation in virtue to know themselves as creatures of God. This is what the family can do, mm-hmm. that I don't think government should try to take over reproduction and moral formation.
Right. So again, there's so many things we could talk about, but one thing I think that, Burke has this line that's close to this, that the social contract or the society is a partnership between the dead, the living, and the yet to be born. And I think solidarity and subsidiarity, but solidarity thinks broadly in that generational element where I think it's Chesterton, is that right? Who says tradition is the democracy of the dead. So you're listening to your ancestors, you're thinking about the future. It's not simply you at this kind of moment who's popped into existence, but rather this multi-generational relationship of society. And that solidarity also helps you think in that generational means as well. Do you think that's correct?
Oh, absolutely. And look, just to show that I didn't get to these ideas of solidarity through books alone, I'll tell another story about a weekend I spent in Port-de-Paix, Haiti, actually a whole week. I went with a group in Miami called Amor en Acción, which means love in action, and they sponsor trips to Haiti. That's mission work. But they emphasize that the end goal of mission isn't a distributive economic end, but building relationships with people, working together, learning from each other. Well, as part of that trip, I sat down with a group of people who were in one of these economic cooperatives where everybody put in $10 a month and then one person got to take the money out and invest in something. And I was so excited to finally be a part of one of these small exchanges. And I asked them all these economic questions. And then finally, this Haitian seminarian from Miami looked at me and he said, why don't you ask them what it means to them as a person to participate in this? And so I asked them that question, and it turns out all their faces lit up. And this older woman said, I know God is good and he always provides and he loves me. And another man said, this is helping me to give my children hope for the future and get them an education so that they can know who they are and love and serve God. And so what I realized was that I was so focused on this group as a means of quote unquote solidarity as economic exchange that I completely missed the symbolic value for the individual members and their vocation with God, but also the symbolic value of being in relationship to other people who are mutually supporting each other to pursue their own individual objectives. Does that make sense? And so what I thought was so beautiful was that they didn't want me there to give them more money. They wanted me there to participate in this free giving exchange of their whole selves, money, but also of themselves, which meant that when one person wanted to open up her business again, the whole group went over there and they took their brooms and they cleaned up the street in front of it and they helped her paint the front of it just to make it look beautiful. So they're serving each other with their talents. And that has a symbolic value that, guess what, is infinite, because it's a sign of the reality of God's love, which is infinite. So I think in the modern world, we don't even really understand that the poor in Haiti haven't absorbed this kind of rationalistic either or framework. They see their everyday activity as an expression of God's infinite love. And they're called to participate in that. That's what solidarity is. It's not, can we get $100 and split it up 10 ways? I mean, that might be a good thing to do, but it's certainly not what they mean by solidarity.
Yeah. So I hear a lot of the influence of John Paul II. It is the person who is at the center of the economy, right? Economic exchange is for persons and for families. And he used this example of what is a business? Well, it's a group of people getting together to work together to meet their own needs by providing for the needs of others. I don't want to get too far in this, but you've hit on a couple of things I've been thinking about lately, that this is one of the reasons why commutative justice, right? Market exchange justice is so important, because it does a couple of things. It stops us from thinking in a zero-sum mentality. Now, again, I don't mean if you accept capitalism, you will become a Christian. That's not what I'm saying at all. I mean, China accepted the technique of capitalist, market societies, but to fuel their authoritarianism. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying, though, is I think this understanding of commutative justice of exchange, that we're participating, right? Which is another theme that Wojtyła deals with a lot, right? Participation as a response to alienation. That man is alienated because he needs to participate, right? So it's, again, his interlocutor with Marx, who Marx wants to have, and again, this is fast and unnuanced, but Marx wants in a sense, a technical structured solution to the problem of alienation, and Wojtyła wants participation. And so what strikes me here interesting is that the zero-sum game, where all of us are fighting over this short, limited element. Yes, there's scarcity, but the idea of commutative justice means that we're actually in relationships and we can, in fact, create more value. So I think actually there's a lot there that needs to be unpacked, but I think it goes back to this human person at the center. And I'm bringing up Poverty Inc. again, but I interviewed a man named Daniel Jean-Louis, who's written a book called Trade, Not Aid. And I think he has a new book come out too as well. But Daniel is economist and business developer. And he has this powerful line in Poverty Inc. where he says, no one wants to be a beggar for life. And the point of that is that we don't just want stuff. We might need something right now, but really we want our stuff and our market exchange to be embedded in a broader understanding of what it means to be a human person, in a family, in a community, as part of flourishing. And I think this goes back to the error of humanitarianism, which is I'm going to provide for your physical comfort, but oftentimes at the expense of making you, quote unquote, a beggar for life. And I think your explanation of that Haitian element is like, that's part of, in a sense, the dignity and the creative capacity. And the other, I think, profound element that it teaches, it both reflects and teaches, is that being is good, right? That being matters and that we're called to complete creation in participation with one another, not simply just to kind of survive in this very, almost reductionist way. Maybe I've taken it too far, so feel free to jump in, correct, or anything on that. And then I want to go into your symbol question in a minute, but what do you think about that?
Well, listen, again, to bring this down to something concrete, we live in a time where everybody wants to talk about inclusion and diversity, but the kind of solidarity you and I are talking about, the kind of solidarity I witnessed in Haiti, and it is inclusive because, for example, the disabled can participate. When I was in Haiti, I visited a home for the disabled and for the elderly, but they participated in singing. We sang songs together. So societies that might be really materially poor haven't forgotten that the disabled and the elderly are human beings who have dignity and who are worthy of respect and who want to belong and participate in something, even if the economic value of what they do wouldn't match an able-bodied person, so to speak. Or maybe it could. In the Bruderhof communities here in the United States, they sponsored Plow Magazine, which published my article. They have workshops that include the disabled, and they're quite economically productive. Mm-hmm. But that's not the point. The point is that they participate alongside the able-bodied. And again, you don't actually see that very much in this country, despite the fact we talk about inclusion and diversity. But what I saw amongst the poor in Haiti was a solidarity where every person, by virtue of being a dignified creature of God, whether they're disabled or old or blind, they have a place at the table and they belong to the community. Whereas a kind of utilitarian ethos has taken over so much in the United States that so many young people I work with really think that their human value is their economic productivity value.
Oh, yeah.
And that gets inside of them. And they start to look at other people in terms of how much they produce economically. And we don't want to bring that mentality to Haiti or to Africa. No. We don't want to imperialize culturally with our reductionistic view of the human person. And the reason young people love going on trips to places like Haiti and Rwanda is precisely because they experience social interaction where you're not being judged by how productive you are. You're being seen and engaged with as a full human person with a heart and with a soul. And to get to your next question, as a person who has a symbolic meaning that's infinitely greater than any material contribution one could bring.
Yeah, I think I'd like to get there because this, I think, relates. This, in a sense, is the bridge to much of what you're doing now. Because, your work at Scala, your work teaching at Princeton Theological Seminary, and your writing is, in a sense, to engage with education and human formation so that people don't simply have a simple utilitarian reductionist view, but in a sense have a poetic view of the person as well. So I'd like to get there, but I'd like to pause for, if you'll bear with me, can I ask you one more question about your story with violence and the women? Mm-hmm. Actually, two questions. The first is something you both write about, but you also kind of articulated here in this conversation. You talked about the man, or was it Carlos, who had the gun? Sorry, which one had the gun? Who was drunk? Who wants to shoot them in the fire? Juan. Okay, Juan. Yeah, here it is. Okay, so Juan was the one with the gun who wanted to shoot off, the machine gun, and he ended up drunk in the car, right? You said, Juan passed out drunk and began drooling on my shoulder, never having celebrated my birthday with rafagas, okay, with gunfire. So here's an interesting question. You talked earlier about virtue and you talk about passions. And obviously we could go into like passions are not bad, et cetera, et cetera. We're going to just keep it on nuance for the conversation. But in a sense that virtues in the tradition, you don't just have one virtue, but that the cardinal virtues are all mutually reinforcing. And like Aquinas and all others where there are daughters of the virtues and there are daughters of the vices. And that when our, like Wojtyła talks about, you integrate or you sublimate in the proper, as you make sublime, the passion, the thumos, right? It gets ordered and then it becomes mutually reinforcing. So if you're courageous, you can be better temperate. If you're temperate, you can be prudent. They're all related. It seems too that this is actually the problem of the passions. That notice that this man you were talking about struggled with violence, drunkenness, right? Pride, you could say like, kind of a show-offness. Maybe, can you just talk about it, maybe especially in the relationship of violence? And maybe this question isn't very good, but I'm hoping you can do justice to it, is this mutually reinforcing element. Like you have to work on to control all of your passions and you have to build all of the virtues. You can't just have one virtue because that, is going to be your thing. I don't mean that you're not going to be better and worse at some things, but that you have to focus on all of them because they all mutually reinforce each other. What do you think about that?
Absolutely. Look, again, just to keep going with the two stories I've shared today, Nicaragua and Haiti, right? Contrast the chaos and the drunkenness and the guns of that weekend in Nicaragua with the week I spent in Haiti in complete abject poverty, no electricity, no magazines, no television, but they had beauty and they had love and they had social order. And what I witnessed was this church that cared for the whole person. It gave them opportunities for worship. It organized people into this cooperative. And the priest wasn't a supplier of money. He was a former of people to be able to realize their own God-given potential. So the idea that somehow faith or religion is imposed upon the poor through colonization from abroad just didn't seem to explain what I was witnessing, which is along the lines of what you're saying, that through this community, solidarity, participation, faith, and worship, people were given the opportunity to pursue the deepest desires of their heart, which are to grow in worship, to know how to love one another, and to create something in this world. And contrast that to the chaos of that weekend, where, and many experiences, unfortunately, of chaos and violence that I witnessed, where you probably also did too, where you're on the edge of your seat because you realize there's a gun around and you might not be walking out of this place with all your money on you or with your bodily integrity because you could get raped or you could get shot in the head. And let me tell you, that leaves a tremendous amount of fear inside of you. And it makes it easy to have an outburst and continue that cycle of violence because you're on edge. And that's part of the reason I wrote this article now. And it's part of the reason why I started Scala Foundation 5 years ago, because I feared that the Ivy Leagues, where I had been teaching, were creating a culture of resentment and anger, people concerned about genuine social problems, but not being given the full picture of how to deal with injustice, and instead stoking their resentment and anger and encouraging them to change other people rather than to change themselves or commit themselves to a cause, to actually commit yourself to working with the homeless or working in the criminal justice system. No, instead, we're going to hold up placards and call other people bad names. That's not changing anything. What it's doing is it's putting more violence out there. So I started Scala because this vision of the human person that we've been talking about, it's the vision that animates Acton Institute where you work, where I've attended. It's the vision that animates Scala Foundation. And if education isn't grounded in the right understanding of the human person, I'm afraid we're going to create a system where it's really easy to light a fire and get a bunch of angry, resentful, fearful people acting irrationally and destroying solidarity. And I'm sorry to say, I started this 5 years ago. We've seen an outburst of this because too much of education is grounded in meaninglessness and hopelessness and promote shallow ideas that don't change the world. Only deep ideas and deep human formation is ever going to change the world. And what I'm afraid of, what I also witnessed in Central America, is that if we don't help young people understand and confront the problems of evil, death, and pain, then when they respond in anger or resentment, it's going to lead to greater burnout and it's going to destroy the very moral basis of solidarity that we're trying to create, which is a phenomenon Augusto Del Noce describes in his book, which I talk about in my article, Why Mystery Over Ideology. You wrote an entire issue of Acton's magazine on ideology. We are living in a time of a closed system of hopelessness, and then ideology becomes sound bites that seem to explain the world, but do nothing but create a kind of word soup because we've lost the universal, timeless values of God's transcendence, of sin and redemption. And paradoxically, in talking so much about social change, we're giving people the wrong framework to have it and create hopeless people.
Yeah, I think, you say, for example, in this essay that you just referred to, Why Choose Mystery Over Ideology, I will put a link up to that. It's excellent. I highly recommend it, I'll put a link up to The Plow, which is also excellent, and to Margarita's book, or books, I should say. So, but you're right. The void left by the denigration of beauty and a classical liberal arts education is directing more and more people to woke social justice, activism, or alt-right movements, because those movements offer them meaning, purpose, and hope, as well as community and sense of belonging. Others burn out psychologically or resort to social isolation because trust and intimacy are hard to experience. Yet others resort to drugs, pornography, other temporary pleasure to fill the void. Still others pursue ambitious and demanding careers without reflecting on how they should live or why they exist to begin with. And the result is skyrocketing rates of anxiety, depression, and suicide. Educational institutions have not succeeded in addressing these problems, leading many to seek alternatives to feed their souls. And now this is interesting because you're teaching at Princeton. I mean, you were at North Carolina before. You went to Yale. I mean, you've taught at all these places. You're talking about the elites are not being given a sense to give them meaning, right? So it's not simply talking about like, oh, those underclass. And this is broad across the board. All of us are struggling with that. First of all, is that correct? And then I have a comment for you.
Absolutely. I think that's correct. But what I'm trying to point out is that this framework that's ultimately meaningless comes from the idea that there's not an objective reality. I mean, I think we've seen our Supreme Court say such a thing, which begs the question of, well, what's the law based on, if not universal truth? I mean, this is confusing. Then the law simply becomes will to power. Well, no wonder people conclude if the law and if all of the knowledge contained in university is nothing but a will to power, why would you expect people to want to then have a social contract where we all sing kumbaya as opposed to treat each other in a utilitarian fashion where I can get as much from you as I possibly can because it's all ultimately about self-gratification because there is no objective truth that unites us. So I hear these questions from young people, right? But they're looking for a positive answer.
Right.
But believe me, they've been told there is no objective truth that unites us, and that truth is nothing but an instrument of power, and the law is nothing but one person's interpretation of right and wrong. And that is what I'm calling meaninglessness, because it's denying what I believe and what beauty does. Beauty corresponds to people's heart because people want to believe that the cosmos is ordered and good. And when you experience a concert, beautiful architecture, a beautiful sunset, your heart says, wait a minute, there's a reality that's external to me and it's beautiful and it's good. And so experiences of beauty, I think, are the best thing to push back on ideology that tells us that we live in a closed system that has no objective truth by which it can be judged.
Yeah, well, I agree. And listeners know I agree. That's a problem. In fact, in the essay I wrote in that Religion and Liberty, Acton's Religion and Liberty, I actually articulate some of the reasons behind ideology. And one is relativism, another is empiricism, and another what I call not I alone, but I call it the theory of everything, that, we're trying to compete with Darwin, Freud, and Marx for this like perfect summation of everything that goes on in the world. It's a desire for a technical solution. But I want to push one thing, because I read you and I've talked to you. I know what you're saying. So I'm going to articulate a critique and a reply. I'm going to critique you and defend you. And then you can tell me if I've got it. Okay. So the critique could be, wow, you've got a really romantic view of Haiti. And you've got a romantic view. I mean, people are hungry, they're poor, it's violent, there's disorder, there's rape, there's violence, there's places you can't go. And that would be, I don't think would be a good critique, because I think your point is not that there's not disorder. You wrote specifically about the disorder in Nicaragua. I think what you're getting to with the Haiti stories and also with the women in Nicaragua who are just doing the very simple work of plowing the land is that it's not the romantic question. It's that even in intense poverty, there's something holistic. And specifically, there's a poetic dimension to life that goes beyond utility. And that those experiences of deep, poetic, human experiences of solidarity illumined your understanding of some of the problems in university, specifically elite education, but broadly university education and high school education, that our educational system and our human formation is reductionist and reducing us to a utilitarian value alone. Our value is only utility. And that because there's no longer truth or beauty or goodness, and the whole poetic element has been neglected and replaced by a reductionist empiricism of people like Dewey et al. And others, that this is actually misshaping the souls of young people and sowing the seeds, not only for the depression and disillusionment you articulate, but possibly the seeds for real social violence in the long run. And that's my understanding. Okay, my understanding is that's really where the connection of these stories go. That both the chaos of Nicaragua, the violence, et cetera, and the simplicity of the women, the simplicity of the Haitian community that you worked in, is saying we're dealing with two very different visions of the human person: technical, utilitarian, or poetic. And that the poetic doesn't ignore the scientific, but that the poetic means that we see things in a much broader way, where meaning and purpose and beauty and goodness and symbol have been neglected. And those things need to be reintegrated into the human being so that we can have integrated selves. Okay. That seems to me, when I see your stories and the work you do at Scala and all the, philosophical work, that it's not simply like, oh, beauty is great and let's all have this elite education. Rather, no, what kind of human beings are we going to be? And what is the educational system right now forming? And it's not forming rich, integrated human beings. It's, to use C.S. Lewis's language, it's robbing us of our patrimony and it's abolishing us as men and women. Did I get you right?
You did. I will just say that I do not have a romantic view of poverty. I've published in the Miami Herald and in America Magazine about my experiences in Haiti. And the point I'm making is simply that we've lost our imagination and our ability to see that even in the midst of extreme poverty and suffering, the best resource to rebuild Haiti is the Haitian people. And we've fallen into this trick of hubris if we think because we see extreme poverty, we're going to fix it entirely with a redistributive effort that goes from top down. That's all that I'm trying to say. Now, is it surprising that the love and solidarity and connection to agrarian life and connection to worship is somehow a fascinating thing that's drawing young people in America to visit Benedictine monasteries, to visit the Bruderhof communities, who, by the way, live economic solidarity, live an agrarian lifestyle, and follow a structure of daily prayer and sharing. So those profoundly human experiences that the poor in Haiti have not lost are precisely things that we can bring into our context. And yes, I am trying to say that to the extent that our educational institutions have shifted to a skills-based utilitarian model of education or a kind of shallow social justice activism, we've missed that integral human formation. Liberal arts education is knowledge, it's ideas, but it's also connection to the material reality, it's worship, and it's about love. And I mean, people tell me that that's a romantic vision of education. And I say, well, what's the alternative? What's the alternative? So, what I'm promoting is kind of a lay, universal, monastic way of thinking about education, where the person is formed holistically, voluntarily enters into community based on self gift and an openness to the transcendent God who gives symbolic value to everything that we do, because inside of us is a mystery that is in communion with the source of our very being.
Right. I like the way you said, well, that's just a romantic view of education. And you say, well, else is there? But in many ways, like it's maybe what you would call a poetic view of education. And poetic, you don't just mean poetry, but in a sense of penetrating the depth and the meaning of things. And I like how in your essay called Why Choose Mystery Over Ideology, you use Luigi Giussani's point with this emphasis on mystery so that it's not just problem solving, okay, which is part of it, right? But curiosity and questioning, like you're on an adventure to understand a broader understanding. So you say, Giussani emphasizes that education forms young people in reason and faith, science and mystery, action and contemplation. And maybe I would add, influenced by the work of Carl Stern and others, articulate rationality and inarticulate rationality, scientific knowledge and poetic knowledge, empiricism and intuition, right? That it's this broad understanding that doesn't just limit us to like one single part of who we are. And we're not rejecting empirical science, but in a sense, bolstering it by grounding it in a broader understanding that being is good and the world is intelligible.
Absolutely. And look, I just want to say that when I present these ideas to students, they find it life-changing. They call it salvific because they're not being taught these ideas. And so what I'm trying to do through Scala is help students and teachers and concerned citizens everywhere understand the foundational philosophical principles that guide a classical liberal arts education grounded in human freedom, striving for solidarity as we have discussed it, and understand that we're living at a crucial time in American history where a different view of educational philosophy that at its root is utilitarian, anti-transcendent, and reductionistic about the human person has taken hold. And it's leaving a wake of personal burnout and shallow forms of social activism. My own story as a Cuban American woman, graduating from Yale, working with Contras, spending time in Haiti, working with political dissidents in Cuba, I have seen through 25 years of those types of experiences the hubris of the academy. And I'm hoping to just call people's attention to the power of small acts of love, to the importance of personal vocation, and to our need for experiences of beauty in the midst of suffering and violence to remind us that God's love is real and the cosmos is ordered and good, which is why we can believe in the possibility of social justice to begin with.
Great. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Margarita, for taking time to come on the Moral Imagination podcast. Thanks for your story. As I said, I'll put links to those things. And I think it's just really profound how those deep theological insights that you ended with are actually inspired by the simple acts of, say, a poor woman who's made the decision to resist violence by small acts of kindness and small acts of good. And I think that's something for us to keep in mind because we can get discouraged, like the world is pushing against us and the ideologies are tempting. And it doesn't mean we shouldn't think. It doesn't mean we shouldn't work. It doesn't mean we shouldn't fight for justice, but that we remember that ultimately it's in that deep interpersonal human experiences where love grows and where we, in a sense, most profoundly resist totalitarianism and ideology. Any last comments for us?
That was beautifully stated. I absolutely agree with that. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, well, thank you so much for being on the show, and we hope to have you back.
Absolutely.
Okay, all the best. Bye.